Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Catholic Mysticism, where we talk about the supernatural and all things Catholic and other various topics that are related to our Lord and our beautiful faith. And I want to take the time right now. On Independence Day, July 4th, 2018, we celebrate the birth of this magnificent country. And I hope that you have a safe 4th of July and a wonderful 4th of July. And be proud today that we live in this great country that the founding fathers and the people that fought in the American Revolution against the tyranny of Britain at that time, that they persevered, and they won for us this great experiment, as Mr. Benjamin Franklin called it. And almost 300 years later, here we are. And despite some of the problems we've had in our country, like all families and all nations and all peoples, we still continue to try and strive to do the best we can and to grow. And certainly that's important for each and every one of us here as American citizens and following our Lord Jesus Christ and the way He asks us to grow closer to Him and more personally to Him each and every day and each and every moment, in fact, of our lives. And we're going to do the show on some of the things that I've thought about over the years about our country, and knowing a little bit about history and how we started gives me a little base to bring the program tonight. And I'm on the Emmaus Brothers prayer line. Can't talk much about the retreat because it's something you have to go on and see what happens. But one of the gentlemen, the fourth, a Hammond, founded a Emmaus Brothers prayer line where about 1,100 men throughout the country are praying for certain intentions that are put forth on a prayer line on an email. So he sent us out for the fourth a homily by, I believe it's Father David Zerilli. So I'm just going to touch on some of the things, not the whole homily as we go in, but I mentioned that I was reflected over a period of years how we've seen the country today, and let's be honest right now as we celebrate this July 4th holiday, that the country is quite divided. Some would argue that we're as polarized as we were prior to the Civil War and during that 4-year period. And whether there may be some truth to that or maybe not, depending on what you believe and what you feel about that. There is a great division in our country right now. I saw a poll for what there were. I'm not a big believer in polls, but it's interesting. I saw a poll where 31% of Americans believe within 5 years we're going to have another civil war. And just at the fact that we're taking polls like that and people are responding, I think it shows where we are this 2018. Certainly the 2016 election, love him or hate him with President Trump, there is a great deal of division. And because of this, and one particular party, I believe they've called themselves a resistance, they're going out of their way, it seems, to not unify, to not try to bring us together as a nation and as a people and to get things done for the benefit of the people and this country. And wherever you stand on the political spectrum, that's not where I want to really begin the program. It's that it seems over a period of years now, this country, despite a revisionist type of history, where the founding fathers are portrayed as revisionists and weren't really believers in God, and this revisionist history that they were deists. And what a deist is, they specifically look at Thomas Jefferson and say, well, he was a deist that believed that there is a God. but God, like a clockmaker, made the beautiful watch and then just let it go, and we're on our own. And certainly as Catholics, we definitely do not believe that. So there is, in history today, this movement that tries to downplay the religious beliefs and aspects of the Founding Fathers. And you notice I'm using the word father. I'm going to use that throughout the program. And if it is offensive to some, I want to apologize right off the bat, because I know that some of this revisionism, they call them framers. And this is because I believe that there were no women involved. So today in the political correct society we live in, we don't want to offend anyone. And while there may be a handful of women that are, I personally don't think most are. So I'm going to use the term as we have for most of our existence as a country for the Founding Fathers. But my main point is not anything against feminism or anything like that. My point is to bring across the movement that is trying to downplay the religious beliefs and aspects of these Founding Fathers. Henceforth, that movement tries to downplay, if not completely eviscerate, the Judeo-Christian principles which this country was founded on. Period. Then there's no gray matter here. It is black and white in this case. The Founding Fathers based this country on the beliefs of a Judeo-Christian system. Now, when you start to attack their beliefs, downplay their religious belief, the faith, whether it be Washington or Adams or Jefferson, whoever, that is the bottom line, that they are trying to undermine those principles so that we can see and become where we are kind of right now. And what is that? A secular society that doesn't have these base Christian principles and relies on secularism and moral relativism to enact policy, laws, and a belief system based on that, if you will. A very dangerous place for us to go as a free republic. Very dangerous. Now, this is no small effort, as in this homily Father Zerilli said. It's, again, to diminish or ignore the faith of the Fathers and our religious convictions of those 18th century forebears. So we've got to remind ourselves, this is what he says in the homily, of our roots. And that's important. That's why when you see, I mentioned that like a family, there are problems in our country because we're human beings. We are under that stain of original sin, and we have that leaning toward concupiscence, and therefore we're going to have problems. There will not be a paradise here because of our nature, no matter what systems we come up with. God will take care of that when he's ready at the end. Until then, we try to do the best we can, and we're going to have sometimes one step forward, two steps back. So with that in mind, with that base to work from, we need to understand that even with the warts that we have, whether it be slavery and some of the prejudices, what we did to the American Indian, horrible things. No one's going to dispute that. But despite this, we've done some pretty good things. And we can't throw out all this history, whether it be tearing down statues of those who fought for the Confederacy or crosses at a World War I monument. We need to have our history intact because we need to know, as Father Zerilli pointed out, our roots. Because when we lose our roots, we are going to lose a base from which we came from, albeit all the good and albeit some of the not so good. And we can't strip away this, and that's by design. It's by design to lose our culture. And we must be very, very, very concerned about this, because the danger is that we replace a Judeo-Christian culture with who knows what. Certainly, and this is a point I argue with people that have told me several times, more people have been killed in religious wars than anything. And the fact of the matter is, more people, by far, have been killed and carnaged in the name of atheism, by far. So that's the danger we run. But it takes you from some instances of the Founding Fathers here. John Adams, this is upon when he signed the Declaration of Independence He wrote to his wife, Abigail, that July 4th ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. Now that's John Adams, okay, proclaiming that this day that we celebrate today should be proclaimed as solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. Okay? There is God used right there in his own writing. And you know, some years after the revolution, 1787, that when we won the war and the debates were taking place at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin stood up and declared, in the beginning of the contest with Britain, when we were sensible of the danger, we had daily prayers in the room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. And then he pauses. He goes on, Mr. Franklin, do we imagine now that we no longer need his assistance? He continues, God governs in the affairs of man. He quotes scripture. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that built it. Franklin says, I firmly believe this. I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of the Tower of Babel. Now, there's a lot of new biographies about Franklin, and I've leafed through them. And I haven't really read a lot of them because remember what we mentioned at the beginning of the program, this movement, and they want to focus in on how Franklin was not a believer, that he had a disagreement with people in his family that believed, and he didn't believe in the things they did, and this and that and that and this. Yet there I am quoting what he actually said at the convention in Philadelphia. So these are the actual writings. These are actual facts, not hearsay, not a 21st century spin on the Founding Fathers. Okay. A few years after that, 10 years later, in 1797, George Washington wrote these words to John Adams. Although guided by our excellent Constitution in the discharge of official duties and guided through the whole course of my public life solely by a wish to promote the best interests of our country, yet without the beneficial interposition of the supreme ruler of the universe, we could not have reached the distinguished situation we have attained with such unprecedented rapidity. To him, therefore, should we bow with gratitude and reverence and endeavor to merit a continuance of his special favors. And this homily kind of concludes. Finally, there is this moving quote from James Monroe, the last founding father to be elected president. In a statement to Congress in 1818, he said, when we view the blessings with which our country has been favored, those which we now enjoy, and the means which we possess of handing them down, impaired to our latest posterity, our attention is irresistibly drawn to the source from whence they flow. Let us then unite in offering our most grateful acknowledgement for these blessings to the divine author of all that is good. You know, Father David concludes, moving words to be sure, and no less true today. And he ends, here's hoping that similar words might again echo in the halls of government. Wow. Yeah, that's for sure. Must echo in the halls of government, not the other way around. You know, just a couple of election cycles again, I'm not sure now, I believe it was the second one when Mitt Romney was running against President Obama at that time, that a particular party there wanted to take out God. And I guess the heat was so bad, you may remember this, that they had to backpedal really, really fast. But the point here is to show how far this movement is going. Because once God is taken out of a picture, there's a vacuum created. This is our history as human beings. This is, again, this is not in my opinion. This is a fact. Once God's taken out in mankind's epic history, a vacuum is then created. And this vacuum is filled, all right, because a vacuum will be. And it's filled usually with an atheistic type of secular belief. And that type of people come into power, and we've got some trouble. We've seen it throughout our history. And this is something, as we celebrate this 4th of July, that we cannot allow to happen. Because, you know, if you follow the show regularly, you know that it's all about the supernatural. It's all about the battle between God and Satan and good and evil. And so while people that may mean well with their particular agenda of trying to get rid of God and religion, that in the end, if they're willing, then they certainly are tools of the devil. But they may be manipulated as tools of the devil to bring about this kind of change, because this change is disastrous. Now, we're not there yet in America. We're not there. But there is, make no mistake about it, a time to raise the alarm, because there is a progressive agenda to do this. And we've seen the attacks on our religious liberty that are being restored under this administration, that in the last prior, we had some serious battles. And there's no two ways about that. And again, people may willingly or unwillingly be used to bring this about. Now, we see this because we see the concerted effort to eliminate any reference to God in American schools and media. I mean, we've seen this now for quite a while. That's what I meant by prior to this administration. We've seen quite a bit of this. You know, the academic world today, very popular, very chic, to debunk the Bible. And in debunking the Bible and debunking Judeo-Christian principles, this leads to a tragic ignorance of true facts that involve what? The birth of the United States. And especially the incredible role that God's intervention played in the American Revolution. Now, you'll get secular scholars, you'll get liberal theologians, they'll scoff, shift away from the Bible, and take that a perspective that removes the Bible as a study of history that you know, if you do that, it's going to have, as we'll be speaking tonight, serious consequences. Now, if we go and take a look at the Bible throughout, let's just start with the Old Testament, a couple examples. Moses warned the ancient Israelites, right? They were under the yoke of Pharaoh and the Egyptians for centuries. And through God and enacting a series of powerful miracles, they were freed. And what did Moses tell the people? He did this in Deuteronomy. Take heed yourself. That is, remember, lest you forget the things that, and lest they depart from your heart, and teach them to your children and your grandchildren. So he's speaking here that they can't forget where they came from. And they need to remind, for posterity's sake, and the generations that will come after the original witnesses, after the original slaves are freed by the miracles of God. Because in our human weakness, it's very, very easy to do. And if they forget, bad things are going to happen to the Israelites. And we saw that. And that same truth holds true for us today. That God in the American Revolution acted. We're going to touch on that later in the show. It's quite evident. And we cannot forget these things. And when I mentioned about tearing down the statues of the Confederacy or crosses at World War I, this is the danger. And this is the action of that movement. To strip away that culture that holds on to these truths. Because once they depart from our hearts, we are willing and going to follow whatever sounds good, feels good, that replaces that vacuum. Got to be very careful of that. Very careful. You look at some of the Old Testament things like Joshua and an established nation in a promised land by halting the waters of the Jordan River, right? And breaking down the walls of Jericho and raining hailstones on the enemy. And the Bible records that other nations even recognize these events as divine interventions by Israel's God. And then centuries later, we see, and we have to, here in the Old Testament, warning the nation of backsliding, again, as Moses said, to remember the former things of old, and how God intervened to accomplish his purpose. And, of course, what is the answer by these liberal theologians and secular scholars? Fairy tales. Fables. Now, we know that's not true, because if we do our research, we're going to find even with these people find their myths, and every myth, we've talked about this before, they're truths. And that's what they don't want to bring out. They like to cover that part up. And one thing in our Western society, because again, remember, we were a Christian society at one time. I mean, look at years ago when confession lines were packed. And there were many, many churches, priests, several priests, nuns, cooks for the priests. It was thriving. It was booming. And the culture, for all its problems, tried to do the best they could, tried to be moral. You look at the way the media portrayed their stories and the way television and movies portrayed the Catholic faith. You look at this, and it wasn't something that was supposed to be mocked, and they didn't do it. And what they remember that we have now in secular Western society that we have lost sight is that God guides the course of history. Job says he makes nations great, destroys them, enlarges them, guides them. Okay? So we have got to hang on, as Moses' word, those Jewish people in Israel. We, as Americans, today, on this July 4th, this 2018, have got to have a resurgence. And must fight and becoming knowledgeable and speaking out against any type of political correctness or reform that tries to strip these truths away from us to make us forget who we were, what we are now, what we are becoming, all under the guidance of God and where we're going to go. And we see how God, I mentioned a few seconds ago, God really did intervene in the outcome of the American Revolution. Okay. So what kind of evidence do we have, and how is this being ignored and seldom mentioned today? And many of you may not even know some of these things. Now, let's look at our first president. And George Washington, despite any revisionism, was a very, very faithful, devout Christian. You read his writings and you will see this in his actual words. And of course we know, obviously, that he had a leading role in the American Revolution and the nation's founding. He had a solid character and a firm conviction. And that was key. That nature was key because it had a direct result on his outlook of America. The fact that Washington lived to lead the young nation certainly has to appear as an act of divine providence. The act of intervention of God in mankind's affairs for a purpose. Right. So in 1755, we've got the French and Indian War. And this is a war that doesn't get much coverage in history. It is a fascinating war. Because it was a war that started with war is total is a terrorist type of attack. Totality of war. What that means is that they begin to burn the stores, the land, completely burn and destroy anything that even the innocent would use or have to survive. War is total terror. It also had a slave ship, the Desiree, that brought the slaves over. And we see then all this turmoil during this war that doesn't get much coverage. So it was an important war because it started a precedent that was very damaging that other cultures and other wars would follow throughout history. Now, Washington was 23 when the French and Indian War took place. And he, on this time, don't forget, had command of the British troops under General Braddock. Now, they're going to figure out, of course, we both know this, Braddock in Washington later in the Revolution. But right now, Colonel Washington was a very good British commander. And the Indians attacked them with a French and Indian force as Washington and his troops were on their way to capture Fort Duquesne near Pittsburgh. And during the battle, Braddock was killed. And every officer on horseback was shot except Washington. And Washington wrote to his brother, "But by the all-powerful dispensations of providence," these are his actual words, "I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. For I had 4 bullets through my coat, 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me." A Native American who fought in the battle later stated, "Washington was never born to be killed by a bullet. I had 17 fair fires at him with my rifle, and after all, could not bring him to the ground." Now think about that. Now remember, I mentioned Washington, as you know, is going to play an extremely important part during the Revolution. And early in the spring of 1776, and this was a pivotal year in the Revolution, the British were in control of Boston. And Washington ordered cannons brought through the snow from Fort Ticonderoga. Now, this is 300 miles away from Boston, to fortify what was then known as Dorchester Heights. And Dorchester Heights overlooked Boston Harbor. Now, that harbor was an important position to try and hold on to, because the British were going to launch attacks. If they could control it, they can control goods and things brought in. So, that's part of the war. You'll read about sieges and things like that, where an army will, and back in, let's use the medieval times, they would surround the castle and stop any type of goods from going in. So basically to starve the people and drive them out, either to surrender, come to terms, and then hope that they would have mercy if they were let into the castle. Anyway, now the British general saw the danger in this. He couldn't have these cannons overlooking the harbor. So he ordered a full assault on the American position. This is General Howe, a very, very important and major character in the Revolution. Now, however, the night before the assault was to begin, a hurricane, or a terrible storm, a southeaster of gale proportions, hit the Boston area and disrupted Howe's plans. So he called off his attack on the American position due to the badness of the weather. And as a result of this sudden storm and the strength of the American position commanding movement in and out of the harbor now, remember, that was important. They needed to have that harbor just as well as the Brits put his control. General Howe ordered the British troops to evacuate Boston. Major, major, major victory. Washington again wrote to his brother, and I'll quote these words, "This remarkable interposition of Providence is for some wise purpose, I have not a doubt." Now, we continue on with some of these miracles of our American Revolution. 1776, remember, it's a pivotal year. General Howe had a British force of more than 400 ships and 32,000 troops stationed around Staten Island in New York. Now, we'll remember something here. And because I don't want to, when I'm giving you some of the news, I don't want to lose something I want to bring out about the whole American Revolution. For the Americans to have beaten the strongest military and powerful nation at that time, and as one British commander had said, a bunch of ragtag ragamuffins will have no trouble running roughshod over them, is phenomenal. Everything had to happen in a perfect sequence. If one thing was out of that sequence, just like our universe that God designed, doesn't happen. And it all clicked into place. And we owe such a debt of gratitude to those colonists, to our leaders, those founding fathers that suffered, such as Valley Forge, which we can't even imagine, and endured hardships beyond our belief to fight for a cause in which they believed. Freedom. Freedom. And remember from a few shows ago, we talked about God's greatest gift to us besides life, and that's our free will. The freedom to choose. The freedom to live our lives with Him or without Him. It's a great gift. It's a great act of love. And that's what our leaders did, our founding fathers, the military leaders, and the men and women of that American Revolution, because they endured hardships. Just pick up a book or research Valley Forge and see how they were so deprived of basics, clothing, food, no shoes, freezing cold weather, storms, and all thinking that the war could end any time and they would be defeated. And what would happen then? And you know, another debt of gratitude, because again, this revisionist, this movement to revise our history, talks about how the founding fathers were very wealthy men, and they just didn't care about the average man and woman. They did it to just protect their interests, their wealth, their land. Well, here's the flaw with that. If they had lost everything they invested, their land, their wealth, to the Brits, and we had lost, do you think that the Brits were going to just say, you know what, keep what you got, guys. We know you led a big revolution here. You've been put in your place. Go back to the basics. You know, we'll let you have your wealth. We'll let you have this. Just don't cause any more trouble anymore. Very, very, very unlikely. They would have been hung. They would have been made examples. And the Brits, more than not, would have snuffed out even the remotest design of any more revolution against them by these men. So they had everything to lose, just as the colonists did. Everything. And most specifically their lives, not just their livelihood. So we owe them a tremendous debt of gratitude, and that's what should be taught. Anyway, so we see then, the point here that I was trying to make, sorry for getting so long-winded, is that this incredible empire, this strong military, Howe has got 400 ships and 32,000 troops around New York Harbor. Washington had gathered 8,000 American troops to Brooklyn Heights, and the British were able to land 15,000 behind Washington's lines and inflict heavy losses on Americans. Truly, you know, when an army gets behind one and then flanks, they're in serious, serious trouble. So he got behind them. And many, many Americans perished because of this. So, in essence, the Americans were encircled on Brooklyn Heights with their backs to the East River. In other words, nowhere to run. However, and here again, we see this providence, God intervening in our history. The weather proved again to be a deciding factor. Strong winds came up and an ebbing tide, and then incessant rain kept the British from further attacking the American position and from moving their warships into the East River to cut off the escape route. Washington then, realizing the danger of position, ordered a nighttime evacuation of Long Island. Now think about that. They're in big trouble here. And this is improbable that they can pull this off. So that evening, about 11 p.m., wind died down, and a thick fog came in, and it shrouded the American evacuation. And when the fog lifted later the next morning, the British were stunned to find that the American soldiers were nowhere to be found. Now, that we can go back and we could look at that cloud, that pillar of fire that protected the Israelites from Pharaoh's army. Here it's shrouded in evacuation. Remember I was mentioning that fine-tuning the universe and God's divine, and if one thing's off, here's the fine-tune. That fog doesn't come in. What are the odds that the British now, encircling the American army, doesn't hear them, doesn't see them? They're on guard, they're on edge, they're waiting, and they have no idea that they're going to evacuate? Wow. But the fog did develop. And the Brits, the next morning, did not see an American soldier. Now, one American soldier wrote, "Providentially for us, a great fog arose, which prevented the enemy from seeing our retreat." Now, the outcome of this battle has been described as so astonishing that many, including General Washington, attributed the safe retreat of the American army to the hand of God. If the wind and rain and fog, and they termed it the heavenly messenger, had not intervened for the Americans, as I mentioned, they would have been captured, Washington would have been hanged, and the revolution would have come to an early end, and it would have been all over. And that's why, again, you can see in 1776, this was such a pivotal, important year in the American Revolution. Now, December of that year, I was just talking about Valley Forge and all the deprivation that those men had to endure. And on top of that, their morale was so low, and they saw their American army dwindling to about 2,000. So what does Washington decide to do? He decides to cross the ice-filled Delaware River and launch a surprise attack on the Brits in Trenton, New Jersey. And don't forget, the Brits had incorporated in their army the very feared Hessian troops, who were tremendously feared, and they were there at Trenton. So now the Americans, they're going to not just attack the Brits, but they're going to attack a mercenary army hired by them, and a very group of people, of men that were tremendously feared, that struck fear in the heart of the American soldier. So the Americans, as we know, they did cross that Delaware River, and they attacked at sunrise on December 26th in a snowstorm. And the wind at their backs and blowing into the faces of those Hessians, because they had been celebrating Christmas the day before. And in less than an hour in this battle, think about this, the Americans captured nearly 1,000 Hessians and lost only a few men. Now that was a feared Hessian army. 2,000 at Valley Forge. Henry Knox, he was an artillery officer during the Revolution, wrote at the victory at Trenton, "Providence seemed to have smiled on every part of this enterprise." And of course, following this surprising American victory, Cornwallis, the general of the Brits, was sent to engage Washington and his troops, who had recrossed the Delaware and were deployed around Trenton. Traveling over muddy roads because it was raining, there was a January thaw, Cornwallis eventually pinned Washington and his troops with their backs against the creek. Believing he had Washington trapped, Cornwallis decided to wait till the next day to, quote, bag the fox. However, during the night, there was another providential change in the weather. The temperature dropped, freezing the ground, and allowed for easier movement of men and materials. Washington troops left their fires burning and evacuated the camp. They were able to move over the frozen roads to attack and defeat the British troops in Princeton behind Cornwallis, endangering his supply lines. And this surprising turn of events in favor of the Americans happened because of a providential change in the weather again. So the escape from a trap and victory at the Battle of Princeton were seen as evidence of God's hand in these events. Now this is important because we can see, again, that if one little factor changes, revolution's over. All right. We see now we're going to move ahead to the year 1777 because another crucial turning point happened in the summer of that year. The British general, Jumpin' Johnny Burgoyne, was marching down the Hudson River Valley from Canada, and he had 7,000 men to join General Howe, who was going to be marching toward Albany. However, Burgoyne was stopped at Saratoga by a force of more than 15,000 Americans who were angered by the brutality inflicted by Burgoyne's Native American allies. Failing to defeat the Americans, Burgoyne and his troops began a retreat, only to be caught in a rainstorm that turned the roads into a slimy bog. So when the Americans crossed the Hudson River ahead of him and blocked his escape, Burgoyne and 6,000 of his troops had to surrender. And General Howe, he never made the trip up the Hudson. His reinforcements and supplies coming from England were prevented from reaching America for 3 months due to contrary winds. Remember the Red Sea, brothers and sisters, that allowed the Israelites to escape? A wind separating that sea. So the defeat of one of Britain's best generals in North America by colonials was a shock to London, but it was viewed as a miracle in Paris. So this became a turning point in the Revolutionary War. How? Because this miracle viewed in Paris brought France into the conflict on the side of the Americans. General Washington wrote of this event, "I most devoutly congratulate my country and every well-wisher to the cause on this signal stroke of Providence." And Roger Sherman, now he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence later, wrote, "This is the Lord's doing, and marvelous in our eyes." Now, we see the similarities of, remember I would mention that the liberal theologians and the skeptical scholars that poo-poo the Bible and try to downplay it. Years and years and years later, we see in the American Revolution similar incidents that happened to the Jewish nation that are happening here for their freedom under Moses and our freedom under Washington and those troops and the founding fathers. Now, we all have heard, as Americans, of General Benedict Arnold, and until he became a traitor. And one of the reasons he became a traitor is he felt that he was, and probably rightfully so, he was undervalued by Washington and leaders. He was a tremendous soldier and did so much for the American side before he turned for the American Revolution. He was actually the hero at the Battle of Saratoga. But because of many reasons, greed that I just mentioned, him being kind of pushed aside where he thought he should have gotten his due, and maybe that's rightfully so. Arnold, as we know, was planning to turn against the American garrison at West Point, and this is key. This was a key position because it controlled the Hudson River. And he wanted about 20,000 pounds. Now, in today's figures, it'd be about $1 million. So that's a lot of money. So there's that avarice, follow that money right through history. And several American sentries happened to stop Major John Andre. Now, he was dressed as a civilian because he was a spy. He was spying for the British on us. And he attempted to return to those British lines. And they found in a hollow space in his boot a map of West Point and the details of an impending attack, thanks to the information given by Benedict Arnold. The unexpected apprehension of Major Andre and the discovery of Benedict Arnold's treachery, again, was widely viewed as an act of divine protection. Now, Yale President Ezra Stiles, this is back in 1873 now, not now, a providential miracle detected the conspiracy of Arnold. The body of the American Army, then at West Point, with His Excellency General Washington himself, were to have been rendered into the hands of the enemy. Now, again, we see this through the American Revolution, all this incredible turn of events, that if one had failed, the American Revolution would have failed. And where would we be now in history? But, you know, we don't have to worry about that. We don't have to worry about that. Now, many of the accumulating battles of the Revolutionary War are also decisively influenced by weather. In October 1781, in an inconclusive engagement between the French and British fleets in the Atlantic Ocean, it was prolonged by shifting winds, which allowed another squadron of French ships with troops and supplies to slip into Chesapeake Bay. And it prevented the British supply ships from reaching Cornwallis, who was then surrounded by 17,000 French and American troops in Yorktown. Now, if you recognize Yorktown, you know we're getting close to the end of the war. That's what the turning point was. So they're facing Cornwallis overwhelming odds, and he attempted a nighttime breakout. He attempted to ferry his regular troops across the York River. Now, the first group made it safely across the river, but then a sudden and severe rain squall blew the second contingent of soldiers downriver, leaving Cornwallis with a much reduced force. This sudden turn of weather completely disrupted the breakout. And as a British colonel commented, thus expired the last hope of the British Army. Cornwallis surrendered the next day, while a British military band played, the world turned upside down. The American victory at Yorktown has been called one of the most influential battles in history, and it ended an 8-year struggle for independence and launched America on a path to becoming a world power. Again, aided by a sudden and dramatic change in weather. Now, remember I had just mentioned Ezra Stiles, and he had no problem believing that God had intervened. Now, again, this is at one point where he was writing from Yale, and he absolutely believed that the American Revolution, especially that Battle of Yorktown, he wrote, who but God could have ordained the critical arrival of the French fleet to assist us in the siege of Yorktown? And Washington, several years later, wrote, it will not be believed that such a force as Great Britain has employed for 8 years in this country could be baffled in the plan of subjugating it. The singular interpositions of Providence in our feeble condition were such as could scarcely escape the attention of the most unobserving, while the perseverance of the armies of the United States through almost every possible suffering and discouragement for the space of 8 long years was little short of a standing miracle. And yet, with the examples I have just given you, brothers and sisters, we see that the critical role of God is seldom mentioned today. And that is truly wrong. It's truly wrong. Because we are forgetting our Creator who got this country started. Because with these examples, and I hope you do your own research, and I hope you read the writings of the fathers, not an 21st interpretation of what they meant. You know, that's one thing now. We see how brilliant these men were in drafting our Constitution. And what do we see today, ladies and gentlemen? We see an attempt to, and I just heard this last week from someone on a news station, that the Constitution must be changed because we live in these contemporary times. Well, no, that's not true. We've done pretty good for 300 years almost, and we don't need to change things that have worked in the greatest experiment in people's history, freedom, and to keep it going. And, you know, during and after the Revolutionary War, the general feeling by the people by the people that were there was that God had blessed the American effort for independence, and that the hand of God had intervened again and again and again to guide events, and this is the key point, at critical times, and not just once or twice, but over and over. And again, sadly, few remember this today, sadly. 1787, Benjamin Franklin's 81 years old. He's urging, okay, this is the guy that dismissed religion. Right? That's what we're told today. He urged the Continental Congress to begin their daily deliberations with prayer. These are his words. I quote him. I have lived, sir, a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And you know what? The Bible states that in several places. And unfortunately, many modern Americans and citizens of the world have forgotten this lesson. And it is revealed in Scriptures. We mentioned a couple of the types, as you call them, that happened with Moses and Israel and Washington in our American Revolution. You know, I mentioned their prophets today, and we've talked about discernment on the show several times. And we need to have that discernment, but there are prophets today, just as there were back then. You, having the gifts of the Holy Spirit, could very well may be one of those prophets. You know, when we look at Jeremiah's talking to Israel of God's warning, and what does he tell him? God says, because my people forgot me, I will scatter them as with an east wind before the enemy. And, you know, his words are consistent when they came from Ezekiel. Because you forgot me and cast me behind your back, therefore you shall bear the penalty of your lewdness and your harlotry. And likewise, Hosea, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from being a priest for me, because you have forgotten the law of God. And I also will forget your children. Now, we mentioned free will. God's going to allow nations whose people ignore his instructions and forget how he has intervened on their behalf to reap what they have sown. That's in Jeremiah and Hosea, by the way. It's not my opinion. That's in the Bible. And as we observe our Independence Day, we need to heed those ancient warnings from the God who worked the miracles of the American Revolution. Now, I'm not trying to scare anybody. Okay? God is loving and God is merciful. But God also corrects. We talked about this in Maccabees, when the fullness of sin, the cup had not been filled yet, and they needed to be corrected for their own good. The cup of iniquity had not been filled, and that's what stayed God's hand. Now, there are many, many people that would argue that that cup of inequity in this country, in our world, let's take our world, is becoming filled much more quickly to that brim. And there will be a correction, and not out of anger or wrath, but to correct us to come back he who intervenes in mankind's history. And that's why it's so important, this July 4th, 2018, to arm ourselves with knowledge and discernment, sort out the truth, to do the tough work, learn our facts and our research, so we can combat, and I use that word, combat, because make no mistake about it, that movement that I talked about that's trying to destroy our Judeo-Christian roots, they're serious. And you know, we need to do our part. For those who are able to fast and pray, that is powerful. And if you can't fast from food or things like that, well, it's just a small things. Giving up an hour TV show, maybe you like to watch once a week or something like that. No, don't watch it that week. Or if you were inconvenienced in some small way, you know, just try to offer that up, as they say. If you're undergoing a tremendous cross right now, be it health, sickness, you know, divorce, whatever it is, loss of a loved one, offer that hard cross as a sacrifice. Because we can, in our Lord, always have hope. And this nation and this world can always have hope. I feel, and this isn't just being ethnocentric, I feel that America is our last hope here. certainly under God. I don't mean in place of God. But God intervening through the United States of America and its people can change the world, because we still are a bastion of freedom. And despite our problems and despite the disunity we have right now, and that's got to change, brothers and sisters. You know, I'm talking to people now, well, you know what, you voted for Trump, I don't want anything to do with you. And just the opposite. You didn't vote for him? You wanted Hillary Clinton? I don't want anything to do with you. And that's not just in social acquaintances or friendships, that's in families. And that's in politics right now. And that's not the way to dialogue. And we see these movements, and make them think about it. There are many universities and higher education and academics, the media, that are proponents of changing what was so successful in undermining what we are as a culture, still Judeo-Christian, despite not being influenced. We can't kid ourselves anymore. Many would argue it's a post-Christian American world right now. We can get it back. We have to start living our principles under God, what He wants us to do. And if each one of us can do that in our lives and offer up those sacrifices, big and small, to Him, great things will happen. And our faith will increase. And when our faith increases, what happens? We are to see the miracles that God does intervening, not just in our lives personally, but in history. And we see that as we celebrate this July 4th throughout the American Revolution. Because those men, contrary to what is taught today, did believe in God, did believe in Him, in divine intervention in this great experiment, in this American Revolution war, to beat the strongest military, the greatest powerful empire at that time, with a bunch of farmers and ragamuffins, as they said. They've got no chance. We'll rock this thing so fast you won't even believe it, and head back home. After 8 years, they lost. And we, through that Constitution, became a world power. One nation under God. And there are plans afoot to change that, aren't there? And we know that. One nation under God. And there shouldn't be resistant movements or a politician calling for harassment of another politician, and to allow them to have any public space and be harassed or leave. That's wrong. It's wrong on any side of the aisle, because it's going to cause problems. And we need to unify under God, because we are all children of God. And in the end result of this is that supernatural battle, because we are still and will be for our lives until the end of our lives or the judgment day in this battle, in this war. And we are those troops that God needs to continue to win souls, because the war is already won by Jesus. But the battles are fought for souls and where they will spend their eternity. And that's where we're the troops, to save our loved ones' souls, our souls, and those who do not believe in Christ. So take heart. Take heart, fellow Christian soldiers of Christ, for we too are part of the movement that brings freedom and peace and liberty under Christ. When the long battles have ended, it's time for our repose. Will welcome us with open arms, hug us, say, well done, my servant. Come and see the place I have prepared for you. Happy 4th of July, brothers and sisters. Good night, and God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.